Thank you for your kind words of introduction. I was here last year at a similar conference, and it's a pleasure to be back here again. And I want to pay tribute to Mark Dunfried and his colleagues at the Institute for the focus they place on soft power and cultural diplomacy. It's one of my particular beliefs that the value of hard power is greatly exaggerated, and the power of soft power is constantly underestimated. And Ireland, of course, is a country that specializes in soft power because we're a country of only 4.5 million people, so we have to be aware that our capacity, Jack, how are you? Our capacity to wield other kinds of powers is very limited. So I want to talk this morning about identity, about nation branding, and about economic development and the economic impact of these elements on a country's prospects. First of all, identity. Who are we? Well, our identity is shaped by our history and our geography and the culture that has evolved in the space, in the island space that we now call Ireland. And because we're an island, that has had a very particular impact on our development. It has meant that we have developed a very strong traditional culture. And this culture is the ancient Celtic culture, which once existed all over Europe, but now only really exists on the geographical periphery of Europe. And Ireland is the Celtic country which I think has, and I apologise to Jack McConnell, the former First Minister of Scotland, because I was Consul General in Scotland when he was a prominent political leader in Scotland and a great admiration for Scotland. But Ireland is, I think, the country where Celtic culture has survived to the greatest and strongest degree. Scotland is our closest neighbour. I think culturally it's a country that has very much in common with Ireland, and the music, of course, is very similar. But I always say to the Scots that how can they possibly claim to have invented whiskey when they can't even spell it? Anyway, I'll depart from that because we spell it with a Y, with an EY, and as you know, donkey is EY and monkey is EY, so why shouldn't whiskey be EY, right? Anyway, Jack will probably have right of reply afterwards. But anyway, so that's the first thing, the island location, and the fact that this island location gave rise to a specific culture which survives to this day in the form of traditional Irish music, the Gaelic language, traditional Irish dance, and Irish song. And these have blended today with the contemporary influences which the Irish have taken on because of the fact that we belong to the English-speaking world, which is the most powerful cultural force in the 20th and 21st centuries. It may not always be the case, but for the moment at least, English-speaking culture is the dominant global culture. And we have been able to blend the traditional and the modern in Ireland in that on one night in any Irish town, you can go to a pub and hear excellent traditional Irish music played not for the purpose of pleasing tourists, but played because Irish people like to play their own music, enjoy playing their own music, which is a very distinctive music which only exists in Ireland and in Scotland. And you can wander down the street and you can go into another pub in the same town where you will hear very good contemporary rock music played. And it is that combination of the traditional and the contemporary which I think gives Ireland its particular identity in the 21st century. Now, our identity has, I think, I agree with Professor Lampkin, that in the last, when we became independent in the 1920s, we could define ourselves in a fairly straightforward way as a country that was predominantly rural, that was conservative in its social formation, that was predominantly and devoutly Catholic, and that had this strong Gaelic tradition. And I think it is the case that over the last 50 years in particular, and I published a book at the end of the 20th century called The New Day Dawning, which was mentioned by Mark, and I described Ireland's 20th century as a century of two halves. The first half being marked by the success of achieving independence, but then by a rather inward-looking outlook or attitude, which became the predominant attitude in the Ireland of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Since the 50s, we have opened out to the world through the establishment of Tourism Ireland, IDA Ireland to promote industrial development in Ireland, and Enterprise Ireland to promote Irish trade and to help indigenous Irish companies to become globally successful. Then I think we entered into a period of what I would call excessive swagger, in that we started to think, as the Professor Lampkin has said, we started to believe our own, that we were invincible, that we could walk on water. And this swagger, I don't think Irish people were very comfortable with it. Certainly when I came back to Ireland after my posting in Scotland and then in Malaysia, I found that the country had changed. It had become manifestly wealthier, materially hugely successful. But there was something had been lost in the country's spirit and characteristic outlook, which has always been the charm of Ireland. We were in danger of becoming less friendly than we had established a reputation for friendliness over a period of hundreds of years, and we were in danger, I think, of losing that. Now I think there is a great national debate going on in Ireland about how we cope with the realities we find ourselves in now, which are, as Professor Lampkin has said, they're not as disastrous as the headlines sometimes imply in Ireland and in the international media. But nonetheless, we do have challenges, and there is, I think, a sense that we need to rethink our identity for the future. And I think this is a very positive aspect. Of course, the crisis is a terribly negative thing, and we will lose output, and people's lives have been affected very negatively by the economic decline, and people are having to emigrate and so forth. This is not a happy story, but there may be that side to it which will, I think, see perhaps a reassertion of some of our more traditional values and a reconfiguration of this combination of the contemporary and the traditional, which I think is the great gift and the great achievement of modern Ireland. To move on to branding. Yes, the brand is something, and I've been branding Ireland for the last 30 years as a diplomat. And when I was in India in the early 1980s, it was a very different Ireland that I was trying to brand, because at that time we were the poorest, the least developed country in Western Europe. And the brand was one of, we are part of, if you like, we are the Western component of the developing world. So we were able to have this wonderful affinity with people in developing countries, in India and in Africa. And that tradition continues to this day, because I break down branding into four parts. I talk about economic branding, political branding, cultural branding, and then the branding through our diaspora, through the fact that we have 80 million people of Irish descent around the world, which means that the Irish brand is not just carried and projected by the 6 million people who live on the island of Ireland, but it is also carried in many cases very successfully and very powerfully by people of Irish descent. And so many US presidents, for example, have Irish backgrounds, going back, way back, but certainly in modern times, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and the good news is that President Obama has a great-great-grandfather who comes from County Offaly, and we hope he will come and visit his ancestral homestead one of these days. So let me just talk about, I think we've covered the economic branding. I think between Professor Lampkin and Niall Gibbons, we've had a very good account of the economic branding. But I think at the moment, the priority for Ireland is to emphasize the strengths that we possess. And the strengths we possess are we have a young, well-educated population, we have an open, export-oriented economy, and we have the capacity to create a smart, innovative economy which can produce goods and services that the world will want to buy. And I think that's the economic brand that we have developed over the last 50 years, from the time of the foundation of the institutions that now promote Ireland economically overseas. And the Department of Foreign Affairs is an important part. Our network of embassies has a very important role in projecting that brand for Ireland in the coming years, because there have been some negative stories, and I'm comforted by the research that's been done, both by Tourism Ireland and by Professor Lampkin, which indicates that this damage is not as great as perhaps we might have feared when we were in the thick of this crisis a couple of years ago. And I was in Dublin, and we started to see, and we set up a monitoring unit in the Foreign Ministry to monitor international coverage of Ireland and to try to engineer responses that could counter some of the negative stories that were appearing in the international media. It is comforting to know that, and I myself have been a press officer for many years. I was government spokesman for 8 years in various capacities, and I know from experience that not everything that's read in the media or that appears in the media necessarily makes a deep impact on people. I remember once working with one of our leading politicians about 15 years ago and constantly coming across people who said to me, "Oh, I saw your man on television during the week," and I would say, "Oh, yes, which subject?" They say, "Oh, I can't remember the subject." So in other words, even television interviews don't necessarily make a profound impact on people. We live in a world where there's an overload of information, and it's comforting to discover from the research that the negative impact on Ireland's image is not as great as we might have feared. The cultural branding, I think, is important. And here in Germany, for example, there are 2 German-language magazines, Irland Journal and Irland Edition, which are published in German, are sold commercially, are produced commercially for German readers, and they are focused exclusively on Ireland. And the reason why people buy those publications is not because they want to read about the Irish economy or they want to know about the latest developments in the Irish political world. It's essentially because of an interest in our history, in our culture, and in our identity. And that to me, is a comforting thought, because it means that out there, in a very competitive media market where people can read all kinds of material, both online and in hard copies, that there is still a market, a big market for information on Ireland. And I regard the figures that were given by Niall Gibbons about the number of Facebook fans that Ireland has as a very significant and a very encouraging illustration of the extent to which we have a reputation in the world that is growing, and that is very deeply entrenched, and is capable of flourishing even in a new media environment where there are so many new and different sources of information available to people. I just want to say something briefly about political branding. Now, I tried to sketch for myself recently what is the Irish brand when it comes to our political role in the world. And I made the following assessment. Ireland's history of struggle to assert our independent political and cultural identity, which went on for centuries, has given us a worldview which has a set of distinctive characteristics. And these can be summarized as follows. In the past, a strong anti-colonial tradition that translated into consistent support for the process of decolonization. So the Irish were among the first at the UN who steadily and solidly and relentlessly supported the decolonization process. And we still enjoy a good reputation among countries of Africa and Asia because of that history of support for the freedom of nations in Africa and Asia in particular. Secondly, non-involvement in military alliances. We're not a member of NATO. We are a member of the EU, but not a member of NATO. Thirdly, a commitment to playing a central role within the European Union. Fourth, a principled commitment to the protection of human rights. Fifth, active involvement in international UN peacekeeping over a 50-year period. Since the late 1950s, there has never been a day in history when there hasn't been an Irish contingent serving with the UN in some part of the world. Next, we attach high priority to disarmament, in particular to nuclear disarmament. And it was an Irish resolution that resulted in the 60s in the creation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And more recently, we were the ones who pushed the negotiations on to ban cluster munitions. And those negotiations were concluded in Dublin some years ago. And finally, a commitment to development assistance as manifested by a successful aid program which has its concentration on meeting basic needs in sub-Saharan Africa. And despite the economic shocks of the last couple of years, there has been no outcry within Ireland to get rid of our development aid program. How can we afford to be giving money to other countries when we have to borrow money from the IMF and the EU in order to keep our country running? So, that is an illustration, I think, of the fact that Irish people do have a genuine commitment to the issue of development cooperation and to supporting the creation of a fairer and more equitable world. Now, I don't claim that these qualities are in any way unique, but I think the combination tells you something about who we think we are and who we would like to be and how we would like to brand ourselves in the international environment. The final element of branding is to do with the global Irish. As I said, there are 80 million people of Irish descent all over the world. And in the last few years, we have made a concerted effort to connect these people with Ireland. In September of 2009, we brought together representatives of the global Irish, about 200 prominent people who are Irish or of Irish descent, who are active in different countries around the world and who had positions of significant influence in business, in politics, in the media, and so forth. And those people came back. And it was a wonderful session in Dublin where they tried to give their views about how Ireland could move out of the economic problems that we were then facing and what we could do to capitalize on the resources of the global Irish. And interestingly, one of the recommendations from that Global Irish Forum was that we should regard our culture and our identity as the specific quality that marks Ireland out from other countries in the world. I mean, and these were mainly hard-nosed business people. What they told us was, every country in the world can manufacture things, but creativity and cultural product are things that are unique to each country, and that Ireland has a particular strength in that area because of the blending of traditional and modern influences, and because we've been so successful over the last couple of 100 years in particular, in the world of literature. And from the high achievements of Beckett and Heaney and W.B. Yeats and James Joyce and George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde, to the popular literature. If you go to any airport bookshop in the world, and I usually do this myself, and you look at the shelves, which are selling English language novels, but to an international traveling public, you will find a huge number of Irish authors who are producing these popular novels, which again have the effect of conveying to global audiences images of Irish realities. So we're trying to galvanize the global Irish. And we've now set up a global Irish network designed to create a two-way traffic of information and ideas between Ireland and those people all around the world who are not Irish born but have an Irish background and identify strongly with Ireland. And this is very important in terms of our capacity to attract inward investment, our capacity to bring in more and more tourists into Ireland, and our capacity also to market Irish products and to make connections globally. Because in the United States in particular, being Irish carries a positive premium. And our business people, our politicians, for example, next week, our new Prime Minister will go to Washington to hand over a bowl of shamrock symbolizing St. Patrick's Day to President Obama. Not many other countries in the world have that opportunity on an annual basis to engage with the President of the U.S. And this tradition of visiting the U.S. on St. Patrick's Day goes back 50 years, I think, to the era of President John F. Kennedy. So that global Irish dimension gives us an additional string to our bow when it comes to branding Ireland. Finally, I would like to refer to an article that the head of Enterprise Ireland, Frank Ryan, published recently about the challenges facing Ireland and the setbacks that the brand Ireland has suffered in the last few years. And I quote, he said he feared that developments in Ireland may have diminished our international reputation. But he went on to say that we ourselves may have lost sight of all that we have going for us and the important stories, such as the growing success of Irish companies in worldwide markets, are going untold, both in international and domestic discourse on Ireland. His conclusion was, we have a strongly positive story to tell, and our story is this, quote, Ireland's best days lay ahead of us and not behind us. Ireland can be the comeback country of Europe. And he goes on to quote the figures of, we are the largest net exporter of pharmaceuticals in the world. We are the second largest exporter of computer and IT services, behind India, but ahead of Germany, the UK and the US. We are the fifth largest exporter of beef in the world. And 1 in 7 formula-fed babies are drinking infant formula that has been produced in Ireland. And if you've had the experience of having a stent implanted, there is an 80% probability that Irish technology from an Irish company will have been used in this process. So I want to finish with a reference to our new government. I'm not a politician. I'm a public servant. I've worked for governments going back more than 30 years of different complexions. But obviously, the appointment of a new government represents the start of a new era. And I was very taken by the speech given by our new Prime Minister yesterday when he took up the reins of office, when he said that he wanted to repair any damage that had been done to Ireland's reputation internationally, and he wanted to make Ireland the best small country in the world in which to do business, in which to raise a family, and in which to grow old with dignity. And that is certainly a message that I find inspiring for the future as we think about how we can move out of the current economic crisis and back to a more sustainable economic model. We're on the way. It's onward and upwards. And I think this idea of Ireland as a comeback country is one I would like to leave with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take a few questions. First from the former Prime Minister of Sudan.
Yes, I'd like to very much welcome Mr. Mulhall's contribution. I disagree with him that he is not a politician. I think he is much more a politician than a diplomat. In fact, he almost persuaded us that Adam himself must have been an Irishman. My comment is that I would like him to reflect on what can Ireland do to persuade its granddaughters and children in the United States to accept the political brand of Ireland that he described in the 8 points.
Thank you very much for that. Well, first of all, when you mentioned about Adam being an Irishman, it's not outlandish because when I was in Scotland, I got to know the Gaelic speakers there, who are the people who speak a language very similar to our Gaelic. It's the same language basically, but two branches, and they refer to Gaelic as the language of the Garden of Eden. So in that case, it means that Irish is the language of the Garden of Eden, which means that Adam must have spoken our language. But there you are. Yes. Well, look, our particular outlook on international relations is shaped by our own history of struggle. And I would say that we have a sort of a, if you can characterize these things in sort of this way, we have a somewhat, radical leaning to our foreign policy. And Irish people do have a definite sympathy for causes, for those who they perceive to be oppressed, because the sort of when we witness oppression anywhere in the world, it always reminds us of our own history. We do have a strong dialogue, as I said, a two-way dialogue with Irish America, and more so now through the Global Irish Network, and the fact that we are placing a new emphasis on the need to connect with the Irish diaspora in the United States. And I do think that anybody who comes into contact with Irish attitudes on international relations will see that we have a particular perspective on the world. But of course, we have to be realistic. The first place in which we try to project our values and to shape wider policies to reflect more fully Irish values is in the European Union, where we are part of a 27-member union. We have a growing togetherness of policy, and Ireland, I can tell you, does take very distinctive positions within those European debates, and we do have an effect in moving European policies in directions that are in keeping with our values. But obviously, Irish policy is not European policy. We contribute to European policy. We do our best to try to shape that policy in a way that we consider it ought to be shaped. But ultimately, we belong to a global community, and each country has to project and argue for its own values and reflect its own values in the best way it can. But clearly, for a country of our size, there is a limit to what can be done. But within those limits, I believe that we do a lot to. And for example, we have taken, over the years, we have taken unpopular positions. We have taken positions that didn't go down well with those in powerful countries with which we have very strong economic interests. So we haven't been afraid over the years to stand up for our own beliefs. And I think we'll continue to have that independence of spirit, which I think is what you referred to. Thank you.
Maybe a final question for the Ireland components? Or, okay, let's go. I want to take turns and make sure we have different voices. Okay.
Thank you. Your Excellency, thank you very much for the speech. My name is Mohammed. I'm from Iraq. I'm currently working on a similar project on nation branding and improve our perception abroad. Taking from your experience on bad press, what's your recommendation for my country on, on the bad press and how the image being projected in Iraq over the press? Thank you.
Well, I've been a press spokesman for 8 years of my working life, and the first thing I would say is that we call people who present a government's position as spin doctors, or people who try to put the best possible complexion on the particular country's policies and identity. And I think that no matter how clever a spokesperson is, the first thing that needs to be done, I believe, is to establish the basic story. In other words, no storyteller, no clever media campaign can tell a story that doesn't exist. So I think that every country has got to concentrate on ensuring that the facts of its situation are positive or are moving in a positive direction. And then I think energetic campaigning. We have always, from the 1950s onwards, and remember, back in the 1950s, Ireland's image was limited and probably quite backward-looking. It was based on very old images of Ireland. We set out with a strategy and a campaign through various arms of government. We set up agencies to promote tourism, to promote trade, to promote inward investment. And we also sent out people to our embassies to work as press officers, to be the voices of Ireland in those places. And we concentrated on the main centres of media influence in the United States, in Britain, and in continental Europe, where we perceived that was where most of the global media was being shaped from. And I think for a country like yours, I think you've got to continue. My sense is that you're on a very positive road. You've got to continue creating a real story that can then be told. And when it comes to telling that story, I think the key to it is to have a clear strategy and to put resources into projecting your story. Once you have a clear and convincing story, then I think you need to have people and resources that can be deployed in various key areas of the world to try and ensure that your story gradually gets across. It takes a long time, by the way. It takes a long time. I mean, look at Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland peace process, the troubles broke out in 1969. The peace process started in the early 70s. It took nearly 30 years for that process to produce the Good Friday Agreement. And it took another nearly 10 years before the actual institutions of that peace agreement were fully established. So no press officer, no communicator, no matter how brilliant, could have talked up the peace process in Northern Ireland at a time when there were actually violent events taking place on the ground. So it took a long time for that process to come to fruition and to yield dividends. And it's really only when you have the story, the convincing story, that the story eventually communicates itself to a wider audience. We did a study of public diplomacy in our foreign ministry some time ago, and one of the conclusions of the study was that for larger countries, public diplomacy is mainly focused on changing images and rebranding. But for many small countries, the central public diplomacy problem is invisibility. And the focus for smaller countries needs to be focused on capturing attention. There are so many players out there looking for space that's available in the global media, and even though the space is now vastly greater than it was before, nonetheless, there are vastly more players now looking to occupy that media space. And in Ireland's case, I think we have managed to combat invisibility through a campaign that has gone on for 50 years in promoting Ireland in various ways, tourism, investment, trade, and also by drawing on the resources of the Irish, the global Irish, and by relying on the appeal of Irish culture. And last year, in the space of 1 week, I saw U2 play in Munich to 60,000 people playing Irish-made rock music. And then the following, a few days later, I saw Moya Brennan from Clonard, one of our great traditional singers, performing in Potsdam to a couple of thousand people. So the cultural offering for Ireland has helped greatly to combat that scourge of invisibility that smaller countries suffer from. Thank you very much.